Hi, everybody. This is the video series in psychology, and right now we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is the abnormal psychology class, and this is part one. So post-traumatic stress disorder used to be located in the anxiety disorders because the core emotional state of those with this disorder is one of anxiety, periodically at least. And it was called out and put into a section now called trauma and stressor-related disorders that includes things like reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, acute stress disorder, and the adjustment disorders. And there are many reasons for this, but it now is an interesting way to diagnose this disorder. It's a bit different than it has been across history. You may be used to thinking that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a disorder that's confined to combat soldiers. And indeed, we find that in combat soldiers, this disorder is far more common relative to the general population. But PTSD is not confined to combat soldiers. In fact, it is a part of the response array that people have when they experience or see or perceive near-death experiences or violence of some kind, generally speaking. But let's talk for a minute about combat soldiers. In the around 2015, about 300 to 375, right in that range, soldiers killed themselves, which is more than the number than annually is killed in combat. We also know that on a daily basis, somewhere between 20 and 25 veterans commit suicide. Now, that group includes people with other disorders than just post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, it includes those without PTSD, but with severe depression. But the number does include those with PTSD, so this is not a small issue. This is not a small thing. Let's look at the criteria for PTSD. It's messy, and it's involved. There are a number of ways to look at this, but let's just take it straight up. So the first thing is you have to have exposure to some actual or threatened death, violence in more than one way. You can either directly experience it or witness it as it happens to others, or you can learn about it in that it happened to some family member or very close friend, some violent act or some threat of death or something of that nature. And then you could also acquire PTSD by experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to the details of an event that didn't actually happen to you. That would include clinicians, wouldn't it? And, of course, first responders, both in terms of experiencing this visually, but also hearing about it. Okay. Then there's a section called intrusive symptomatology. This is having recurrent memories of the event, recurring distressing dreams, which are activated by such events. We know that people who have depression and anxiety are more prone to nightmares and disturbing dreams. It also appears true that that you may not have significant anxiety or depression and have disturbing dreams, and that appears to be a sometimes a hallmark of a pending PTSD syndrome. And then once diagnosed, it's fairly typical to have distressing dreams of those events. And then there's dissociative reactions, as if the event were happening to you. So you would have perhaps what we call flashbacks. There may be actually loss of awareness of what's going on around you and feeling as if you're back in that awful situation. And then lots of intense and prolonged psychological distress at exposure to symbolic cues. So if you were, for example, a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and had a lot of terrible things happen as a result of that, in terms of seeing death and dismemberment and so on, and maybe being shot down, maybe being shot at, maybe being wounded yourself, you may later, decades later, a decade later, 2 decades, whatever, because it can be delayed, can't it? Yes. Hear a Huey chopper flying over, or a group of them used by Air National Guard, and have an intense reaction to that. Okay. The next section is on persistent avoidance of the stimuli associated with that event. So you avoid that topic in terms of memories or thoughts or feelings, and then you avoid and make efforts to avoid anyway reminders of that, say people, particular people or particular symbolic events. But I can tell you that I wonder if this is something that should be included, and that is there are some people with PTSD who actually talk about it an awful lot, despite the fact that they have PTSD. So there's that group as well. And then we have what's called negative alterations in thoughts and in feelings, internal feelings or mood. And then they either begin with the event or worsen after the event. And it includes a couple of other things from a list of 7, which is the inability to remember specific parts of the events, exaggerated negative beliefs about oneself, like pathological guilt, I'm bad, I'm horrible, I'm no good, those sorts of things, I should have done this, distorted ideas about the cause or the consequences that induce self-blame, and so you see that routinely. Negative emotional states, lack of pleasure, the word for that is anhedonia, an inability to feel pleasure. Sounds awful. It is. Distancing from others, separation from others, and then not being able to have any positive emotions on any consistent basis. Yeah, so now we're talking about an overlap here with the symptomatology of depression, you see, separate from depression itself. Kind of interesting. The criteria for depression are different, but the description of the components of depression look an awful lot like the negative thinking and feeling that people with PTSD have as well. Alterations in arousal and reactivity, so irritability with an angry outbursts, that's very common, particularly towards people that they love. Maybe that has to do with the resiliency you believe they will have, such that they can tolerate your outbursts, that they will allow you to emote. But when that becomes physical or destructive or verbal or physical violence, that's obviously horrific, isn't it? Then self-destructive behaviors, recklessness, things that driving cars really fast and out of control and things of that nature. That, of course, overlaps with manic episodes in bipolar disorder, doesn't it? Then hypervigilance, so scanning the environment for potential danger on a regular basis. Exaggerated startle response, which overlaps with many anxiety disorders. Diminished concentration, which overlaps with depression. And sleep disturbance, which also overlaps with depression. You see where I'm going with this by making those comments. That if you have depression and you have some trauma in your past, which is not unusual. You have to decide what you're really looking at in a client. Okay, you have to know this and parse it out. Okay. The disturbance has to be greater than a month. It has to cause significant distress or impairment, and then it can't be due to medical issues. The one thing I will add is, in part of the self-injurious kinds of behaviors, we could include substance use, because medication of anxiety is very common. It's almost universal to see alcohol use or marijuana use. So I want you to know that this is a complicated and messy set of ways to look at diagnosing a condition we call post-traumatic stress disorder, which over history has been called a lot of things, starting with things like in the 1700s nostalgia and homesickness, because when people have PTSD, they often wish they could go home, particularly soldiers. Wounded soldiers are known to call out their mother's name. They'll call out for their mother, wanting to go home, a place of safety. In the Civil War, soldier's heart, an irritable heart. World War I, shell shock. World War II, combat stress reaction, battle fatigue, combat neurosis, combat exhaustion, all sorts of names. Stress response syndrome in 50s to 70s, Vietnam War and after, PTSD, and then the Gulf War syndrome was added as roughly an equivalent to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we don't know why some people end up with PTSD and others don't, because not everybody that experiences a trauma, in fact, the majority of people, do not develop PTSD. So what are some of the vulnerability factors? We like to think about there being a vulnerability both at a biological, genetic, hereditary level, and as well an environmental level. So what do we see? So when we go back in history, we see childhood trauma, so things like physical, sexual abuse and extreme emotional abuse. We see borderline, paranoid, dependent, and antisocial personality disorders more commonly than the general population within people who have PTSD. Very poor family or peer support. So social skills comes into this at some level. Social isolation comes into this. So we're in the midst of a virus, a pandemic. You're going to see a heightened percentage of people developing post-traumatic stress disorder due to isolation. We know there must be genetic vulnerabilities. From family studies, we don't know what that is at the genetic level necessarily, specific genetic level, at the gene level. Recent stressful changes can erupt PTSD as if it were lurking under the surface. And then if someone sees things with an external locus of control, they don't think that they have a lot of control over what happens in their life, that it's set by the environment or other people. That's a factor. And then recent drug and alcohol use can perhaps even serve as a trigger. So how common is this? Well, it's around 3 to 4% of adults in the U.S., twice as common among women because women are more victimized in general. In heavy combat soldiers, it's between 35 and 50%. In non-combat soldiers, between 1 and 14%, depending on the study. Among those tortured as POWs, 50 to 75%. And in natural disaster victims, up to 16%. Part 2 coming up.